Welcome to this new video of the Jakarta EE Quickstart guides. In this tutorial I will demonstrate how you can set up a database for your MicroShed integration tests. As an example, I left the application in the same state of the previous video, but added an additional endpoint to this application. So now the sample application we used during the last videos needs a JDBC connection to a database. And to actually verify this, I've created a simple JDBC endpoint which will just print out the database name and the major and minor version, which we get from injecting the data source. So to actually then verify our application integration tests are actually using the database we provided. For this, I made some adjustments to the server XML. So the first thing I have added is we now need the JDBC feature. So this example I'm showing you here also works for JPA, so this doesn't matter, but for simplicity I will show it just with JDBC. Next we have to configure our data source here. So first important thing is we have to copy or provide the JDBC library. It's in this folder here, config Postgres, and there I've downloaded the latest JDBC driver. Also make sure then to adjust the Docker file. So while building the Docker image, we have to actually copy this folder into our Docker container, so to have it then during our runtime. Next is we have to provide some properties for the Postgres connection. Now here it's important to actually make this dynamic based on environment variables. So here the server host name, the port, the database name also could be dynamic, but for now I hard-coded it here, but it's important that the username and password are not here in plain text, rather are gathered from an environment variable. So with this setup, we can now inject this data source by its JNDI name here, like I showed you in the resource here. And what we now have to do, we have to somehow create a new container for this Postgres database. So the example works with Postgres, but you can imagine this is also working for any other database you're using. But for Postgres, there's actually a Testcontainers dependency available, which manages the PostgreSQL container. So this I've included here to the project, and now we can adjust our application setup. So now we need this container here. So let's create a new container setup here, and we will use the Postgres container provided by Testcontainers here. So let's call this PostgreSQL container and import it and create a new instance of it. And while creating a new instance, we first also have to specify the network alias. Let's call it my Postgres. So our application will then be able to reach it. Then the port. So let's use the default port. Then we also have to specify a username, might be Duke, and the password. So it's also Duke with a number. And the last thing is we have to give it a database name. So I hard-coded users, so I will also use users here. And now our application container actually needs this information. So we can now here also pass the environment variables. So I will use here now the host name we used and then put in here my Postgres. So we need this actually 4 times. The next one is the port, which is the default port. Then we need the username and the password. So username is Duke, password is Duke42. So what you can also do here is to not duplicate this and make manual arrows. You can also extract this to a constant field and reuse it for the PostgreSQL container setup and also for the application setup. I will skip this for now. It's rather simple, but if this grows, this is might be error prone. So this is now everything we need for the PostgreSQL container. Let's have a look at our sample resource. So we can now write a test for this. I will put it into the test class we already have, and now use a new test method. Let's say should return database information, and let's get the response. So this will be a JSON object. Maybe first that it's asserted it's not null, and then for some reasons let's just print it to the console. We could now do further assertions like check that it's actual Postgres and it has the version, but this here is doesn't make sense. It's just there to provide you an example how you can set up everything for a database connection. So now let's execute all our tests and see if the test passes. So this will now start 3 containers, our application, our mock server from the last video, and now also our PostgreSQL database instance. And you see we had 3 test runs, all were successful. And within here, the last tests, it prints out the result of our server. And you now see here that it actually could inject the data source and could provide the values based on the database connection. So this is now working, and like already mentioned, so this also works if you have a JPA set up. If you want to test it, you can actually, like if you have a CRUD API, you can store users or whatever entities you manage. So with this setup, you then just need to include your persistence.xml, specify which data source to use, and then this same setup also works for JPA. See you in one of the next Jakarta EE Quickstart guides.